April 10, 1912, 10 a.m. England time. A crowd gathered at the Southampton port. Friends and family of passengers, along with countless curious onlookers, came together to witness the beginning of a journey by an ocean giant, the Titanic. But what those people didn't know was that they were witnessing much more than a ship's departure. They were witnessing history. The Titanic's first voyage would also be its last. And for most travelers, the wave before departure wasn't just a see you later, it was goodbye. After leaving England, the Titanic made a quick stop in France and another in Ireland to pick up a few more passengers. And then, with more than 2,200 people on board, the ship finally launched into open sea, heading to the other side of the Atlantic Ocean. The next stop would be New York in the United States. But there was a stone in the middle of the path, made of ice. An iceberg, probably from Greenland, crossed the Titanic's trajectory on the night of April 14th, and the impact was catastrophic. Despite the crew's immense efforts, there was no escape. In the early hours of April 15th, the ship that they said not even God could sink succumbed to the forces of nature. And in less than 3 hours, it split in half and sank in the middle of the Atlantic. In that time, just over 700 people managed to escape in small boats and were rescued alive by another vessel. But for everyone else, the journey aboard the Titanic was the end of the line. From that day forward, the Atlantic Ocean floor became the tomb of 1,514 people, victims of one of the most well-known tragedies in human history, the sinking of the Titanic. But almost like a paradox, the wreckage of this so well-known tragedy took more than 70 years to be found, in a story almost as surprising as the Titanic itself. And this video tells that story. Why did it take us so long to find the Titanic? At least in theory, finding the Titanic shouldn't be that difficult. In the interval between the collision with the iceberg and the sinking, crew members sent a distress call through radio telegraphy, a message in Morse code informing the exact location of the ship, so that the radio equipment of nearby ships would receive the signal and send help immediately. But here's the first problem. Between the moment the distress call was sent and the actual sinking, more than 2 hours passed, and during that time the ship continued to drift, floating, which would already be enough to move it significantly away from the initial point. And even after the ship sank completely, the second obstacle emerged. In the accident region, the ocean has a depth of approximately 4,000 meters. To give you an idea, that's almost half the height of Everest, which is the highest point on Earth. The underwater universe is immense and terrifying. But back to the Titanic wreck, the ship's debris didn't descend this abyss toward the ocean floor straight down, but diagonally. In other words, maritime currents could have taken the wreckage in various directions. This considerably increased the search radius to find the debris. And as if all these obstacles weren't already enough, remember I said the crew sent a distress call with the ship's exact location? Well, actually, it wasn't that exact. Some studies done later showed that the telegraphed message contained wrong coordinates, either due to some equipment failure or even, who knows, the operator's nervousness, which, honestly, I'm not even going to judge. But luckily, this didn't prevent a nearby ship from finding the survivors shortly after the accident. The Carpathia was about 90 kilometers from the location, and when the radio picked up the distress call, it changed course and headed toward the informed coordinates, and along the way, it found the boats with passengers, but didn't have time to find the Titanic. It had already sunk. And all these obstacles only increased the search area for the ship, which was already gigantic. And another problem was the lack of technology. We're talking about 1912. If even a century later it's still difficult to reach the ocean floor, I don't even need to mention how it was back then. Anyway, technical difficulties didn't prevent rescue attempts of the wreckage. And if you don't have a dog, you hunt with a cat. Or if you don't have a sonar, you hunt with a magnet. Yes, if equipment was lacking, creativity was abundant. There were many proposals to find the Titanic, some of them quite unusual. One of the first involved giant magnets. The idea was to place these devices on the bottom of a submarine until they were attracted by the metal pieces of the sunken vessel, and then more giant magnets could make the ship rise. It's just that more than the desire to find the Titanic, many people's idea at the time was to bring the ship back to the surface. And for that, some very creative suggestions also emerged. Some people suggested tying balloons to the ship's hull, and others wanted to fill it with ping pong balls. And you might be thinking these ideas are bad, but no, actually, they're terrible. At 4,000 meters deep, the pressure is gigantic. Balloons and ping pong balls would implode long before reaching the bottom. To get around this problem, some people suggested using glass spheres, capable of withstanding great pressures. But the ship was almost 300 meters long and weighed about 50,000 tons. The cost of this operation would be absurd, not to mention the technical difficulty of putting this plan into practice. Other ideas were put on the table, but were soon discarded. There were those who suggested injecting tons of liquid nitrogen or Vaseline to make the ship transform into a kind of iceberg and float to the surface. Or even those who proposed using dynamite to cause a shake in the ocean and bring at least the victims' bodies to the surface. But it's worth remembering that they didn't know at the time the exact depth at which the Titanic was, and they didn't know that with all that underwater pressure, well, there were no more bodies to retrieve. All these plans faced technological and financial obstacles that prevented any successful operation. Also because a few years after the sinking, the world found itself facing World War I, and a few years later, World War II. It was a period when investments in technology and underwater exploration were dedicated to military strategies, and there was no interest in spending so much time and money searching for a ship's wreckage. But in one of life's ironies, it was precisely thanks to the wars that the Titanic would be found more than 70 years after the sinking. And this story begins in 1980 with an oil magnate named Jack Grimm. Having nothing else to do with so much money, Grimm liked to sponsor quite peculiar expeditions. He decided he wanted to find the Titanic, but this wasn't the first vessel he tried to locate. Before that, he had already searched for Noah's Ark, and it doesn't stop there. Grimm had also gone after the Loch Ness Monster, and even the hole in the North Pole that would prove the hollow Earth theory. Yeah, let's say the search for the Titanic wasn't exactly in good hands. But that's okay, because the crew this time had special reinforcement. A monkey. I told you this story would make a movie. The monkey was named Titan and supposedly had a magical power to point at the map and indicate the precise point of the wreck. And if I tell you that this monkey managed to hit the exact location dead on, would you believe it? I hope not, because that's obviously a lie, as if the monkey would have that capability. The fact is that the human crew members were uncomfortable with the monkey's presence on the ship, and two oceanographers who were on the expedition even gave Jack Grimm an ultimatum, either the monkey or us. And at first he chose the monkey, but in the end he realized that without the oceanographers he'd be left high and dry, or in this case he wouldn't see any ship at all. In the end, this time without the monkey, they made some expeditions together. The technology here was much more advanced. Remember, we're already in the 1980s. Sonar allowed sending a sound wave to the ocean floor. The time this wave takes to return allows calculating the exact distance between the surface and the ocean floor.
In this way, you can map everything down there. But even so, they couldn't find the Titanic. Even without success, Grimm's expeditions helped produce very extensive material about the wreck region. It seemed that finding the Titanic would only be a matter of time. And that's exactly what happened, thanks to another explorer who would write his name in history as the person who finally found the Titanic. I'm talking about Robert Ballard. He was an oceanography professor and United States Navy officer, and he worked at the Woods Hole Institute, a research center that developed underwater exploration equipment. He was passionate about the sea, and he also dreamed of finding the Titanic's wreckage. In the early 80s, he developed a small submersible called Argo. It was unmanned equipment, a kind of robot that was tied to a cable and could descend up to 6,000 meters deep from a surface vessel. Argo had two functions at the same time. It was a sonar and also had a camera attached. It wasn't the first time someone filmed the ocean floor. This was also done in Grimm's expeditions, but with one crucial difference. Argo's camera could transmit images in real time. In other words, there was no need to wait for the tape with the recording to arrive to watch later. It was possible to see the ocean floor live, and this made exploration much easier. Ballard asked the American Navy for support to try to find the Titanic using Argo. The military wasn't that interested in searching for the ship's wreckage, but they were very interested in finding other wreckages, 2 submarines that imploded during the Cold War. And unlike the Titanic, the coordinates of the Thresher and Scorpion submarines were known, but the Navy didn't have enough technology to go down there. But the military needed to know exactly what condition the submarines were in and how the nuclear reactors were. Also because they wanted to make sure that the Soviets, their adversaries in the Cold War, hadn't managed to reach the wreckage either. That's when the American Navy made a deal with Ballard. You help us film the submarine's wreckage and we'll let you use all the Navy's apparatus in your search for the Titanic. And the search for the ocean liner would also be a way to cover up the American military operation, since the United States didn't want it to leak. And so it was. After documenting the Thresher and Scorpion in detail and confirming that the reactors were intact, Ballard and his team headed to the Titanic region. Luckily for him, it was exactly between the wreckages of the 2 submarines. The idea then was to descend with Argo and search a large area where the ship could be, and Ballard intended to use a strategy known as mowing the lawn. Imagine you need to mow the grass in a square area. You start at the top, walking with the mower from left to right, and when you reach the right end, you go down a bit and start walking to the left. Then you reach the left side, go down a bit more, and go back to the right, and so on until you finish passing the lawnmower over the entire delimited area. But Ballard didn't have all the time in the world. The deadline the Navy had agreed with him was 12 days, and there wouldn't be time to mow the grass of the entire area where the Titanic could be. But then he had a brilliant insight. Ballard remembered the scenario in which he found the submarines. The main part of the vessels was at a certain point, and around them there was wreckage scattered concentrically, that is, many debris in a circle format around the submarines. The closer to the submarines, the more concentrated the wreckage was, and as you moved away, the circle of debris became increasingly spaced out. So Ballard thought, that's it. Instead of looking for the ship itself, it's much easier to look for debris scattered on the ocean floor, and that way you just had to find a single piece of wreckage and then look for others around it, until they led directly to the ship. And that's made things easier because it wouldn't be necessary to mow the grass of the entire area. You could space out each pass of Argo much more, even if perhaps the equipment failed to film the ship itself. It wouldn't be a problem because the most important thing was to cover the entire area, and then any wreckage found would already be enough to find the Titanic. And that's exactly what happened on September 1st, 1985. It was already the beginning of dawn when the Argo camera detected something different from everything Ballard and his team had seen until then. It wasn't an animal, it wasn't rocks, and it wasn't anything that seemed natural. They were facing a piece of metal. And since Ballard spent years studying every detail of the Titanic, he had no difficulty identifying it. That was one of the ship's boilers. At first, of course, the crew celebrated. Everyone was shouting and hugging because of that historic discovery, until someone looked at the clock and commented that it was 2 in the morning, practically the exact time the Titanic had sunk 72 years earlier. And it was then that the party, for a moment, gave way to silence. The group of explorers realized they were seeing much more than an ocean liner's wreckage. They were in fact the first human beings to observe the place where 1,500 people had died. It wasn't a place of joy, but rather a place of respect for the men, women, and children who lost their lives tragically and who didn't have the right to be buried or cremated by their loved ones. That moment was the closest all the victims had to a wake 70 decades after death. And after the minute of silence, Ballard and his team continued exploring the site to map all the wreckage until reaching the ship's main part. Or rather, the ship's 2 main parts, because besides finding the wreck's coordinates, that expedition made a series of other discoveries. One of them was that the Titanic didn't sink whole, but divided into 2 pieces separated by 600 meters from each other. The stern was completely destroyed, almost unrecognizable, but the bow, which is the front of the ship, was surprisingly preserved. This happened because the collision with the iceberg wasn't frontal.
Actually, the iceberg toward the right side of the Titanic, allowing the entry of more than 40,000 tons of water, mainly near the bow, and with this, that part of the ship sank relatively intact.
The stern, however, had many air pockets inside, and when the ship sank, the pressure from the ocean floor imploded these compartments and destroyed everything inside. Everything and everyone. Yes, Ballard's expedition and others that came later also revealed some morbid curiosities. Many pairs of whole shoes were found positioned side by side. They were the footwear being worn by people when they died, and it's, let's say, where people still are today. Their bodies disappeared, first serving as food for the animals that inhabit those depths, and then with the bones themselves dissolving at that depth. But the shoes, made of leather, remain intact. And Ballard's expedition also found a head, but calm down, a doll's head, which remains a sad reminder that of the 109 children on board that night, 53 died, 52 from third class, where the poorest families stayed. And since this is the depressing moment of this video, many animals also died on the Titanic. Of the 12 dogs on board, only 3 managed to escape. But at least the survival rate must have been a bit higher for the lobsters that were in the restaurant. They saw in the sinking a miracle to escape death. And speaking of underwater life, besides the human bodies that dissolve to the bottom of the sea, what should also dissolve over time is the Titanic itself. In the coming decades, the ship should disappear, mainly because of the action of bacteria that feed on iron. There are so many bacteria that even a new species has been discovered in the wreckage and was named Halomonas titanici. And little by little, they're consuming the wreckage and causing the collapse of what remained. Take a look at this comparison published by the BBC. In an interval of less than 15 years, a relevant part of the ship's railing disappeared, and this continues happening all the time, including right now while you're watching this video. Nobody knows for sure when the ship will completely disappear, but in doubt, there are people who don't want to waste time and dream of visiting the Titanic's wreckage while it still exists. That was the case of film director James Cameron, who descended several times to the ocean floor to produce material for the movie Titanic, and other people who pay expensive tickets for this risky journey. But maybe this isn't a good idea. You must remember the Titan, that submersible from the OceanGate company that took 5 people to see the Titanic. The vessel imploded in 2023 due to small cracks in the hull, and this immediately killed everyone who was on board. Therefore, for those who want to know more about the Titanic, there are somewhat safer alternatives, like museums. In Belfast, Northern Ireland, where the ship was built, you can even enter another vessel. It's the Nomadic, which is the Titanic's little brother, and the only remaining ship from the White Star Line, which produced ocean liners at the beginning of the last century. And in Liverpool, England, you can read newspapers from that time and see up close a series of objects that were rescued from the wreck. And this, in fact, is a controversial point. Some people argue that nothing should be removed from the ocean floor so that the place continues being a kind of memorial for those who died in the accident, and others say it's important to bring back everything possible, even to preserve history and prevent objects from being lost over time. Either way, the fact is that these museums, besides telling the Titanic's trajectory, help honor the victims and also the heroes who braved the ocean floor to find the wreck, which allows us to understand, even today, what happened on that cold April night in 1912. But tell me here in the comments, what other story would you like to see told here on the channel? And don't forget to like the suggestions you enjoy most. Thank you very much, and see you next time.